The last thing my daughter said to me before the phone lines died was, "Dad, there are people eating each other outside the school." She was 16. She said it the way you might say, "There's a weird dog in the yard." Not screaming, not crying, just stating a fact that didn't fit anywhere in her understanding of the world. I could hear other kids in the background, not panicking yet, but close. The sound young voices make when they know something is wrong, but the adults haven't confirmed it. So they're holding themselves at the edge, waiting for permission to be terrified. I said, "Sophie, listen to me. Go to the second floor. Stay away from windows. I'm coming to get you." She said, "Okay." And then the call dropped. Not ended, dropped. That dead, hollow nothing that means the network isn't busy. It's gone. I tried calling back 40 times. 40 times I pressed her name on my phone and listened to silence. I drove 106 miles to Bloomington in under 90 minutes, armed with a Remington 870 and a level of terror I didn't know a human body could sustain without the heart simply quitting. And I found her. That's not the story, but I need you to know that, because if I hadn't found her, there would be no story. There would be no farm. There would be nothing, because I would have kept driving into whatever hell the cities had become until something killed me, and I would have been fine with that. But I found her, and I brought her home. And then I looked at the land, 1,200 acres of flat Illinois nothing, my family's ground since 1931, and I realized that everything I'd inherited wasn't just a farm anymore. It was a raw material. It was the difference between living and not living, if I was smart enough and fast enough and hard enough to turn it into something that could be defended. I wasn't a soldier. I wasn't a survivalist. I was a 44-year-old divorced corn and soybean farmer with a cow-calf operation, a welding rig, a decent parts inventory, and the kind of stubbornness that comes from 3 generations of men who refused to sell when selling was the smart move. That stubbornness, which my ex-wife called a personality disorder and my banker called a credit risk, turned out to be the thing that saved us. Saved all of us. The 23 people who eventually lived inside the perimeter of the Mercer farm, eating my grain and drinking my well water and sleeping in buildings my grandfather built. They're alive because I am constitutionally incapable of giving up on a piece of ground. This is the story of how that happened. Not the Hollywood version. Not the version where I'm standing on a rooftop with a rifle looking heroic while the music swells. The version where I'm covered in manure and diesel fuel, arguing with strangers about water rationing, burying a man I'd known for 30 years in the East Pasture, and trying to keep 23 people alive on a farm that was designed to support 1. Let me start at the beginning. The real beginning. Before Sophie's phone call. Before the headlights on County Road 600. Before any of it. Let me start with the week when the world was still the world, and the only thing I was worried about was the price of corn. It was the second week of October. Thursday. Harvest season. I had 600 acres of field corn standing at 14% moisture, which is almost perfect for combining, and the 10-day forecast showed nothing but clear skies and cool nights. This is the kind of week Illinois farmers pray for. You don't waste it. You run the combine from first light until you can't see anymore, and then you run it another hour with the lights on. Because weather is a promise the sky makes and then breaks whenever it feels like it. My plan for that Thursday was simple. Finish the northeast quarter before noon, swing the combine down to the south fields after lunch, and run until 8 or 9 at night. A normal day. The most normal day in the world. I was in the machine shed at 6:30 in the morning, replacing a solenoid on the grain dryer. A 20-minute job, a $14 part, when my phone buzzed. Text from my friend Darnell, who drove long haul for a regional carrier out of Decatur. All it said was, "You watching the news?" I wasn't. I was watching a corroded wire nut and trying not to strip the threads. I texted back, "No, busy. Why?" and went back to work. He replied with a link. I didn't open it. During harvest, I don't open links. I don't watch videos. I don't read articles. The world outside the fence line stops existing for about 3 weeks while I get the crop off. And that's the way it has to be, because a combine doesn't care about the news, and neither does the weather. I finished the solenoid. Tested it. The dryer kicked on clean. I walked to the house to fill my thermos, and on the way I checked my phone again, because Darnell had sent 3 more messages. The last one said, "Dale, I'm serious. Turn on the television. Something is happening in Philadelphia." So I turned on the television. What I saw was helicopter footage of a section of downtown Philadelphia that looked like someone had kicked over an anthill. People running, not in one direction the way they do for a fire or a gas leak, but in every direction. Chaotic, circular. The kind of movement that means there is no safe direction. The anchor was speaking in that carefully controlled voice they use when they don't fully understand what they're describing. She said there was a mass casualty event, possibly linked to a contamination incident at a medical research facility. She said hospitals were overwhelmed. She said the National Guard had been activated. On the screen behind her, I watched a man tackle a woman on a sidewalk, and then 3 more people piled onto both of them. And the camera cut away so fast, you knew the operator had seen something the network wouldn't broadcast. I watched for about 10 minutes. Then I turned it off and went to combine corn. I know how that sounds. But you have to understand, in farm country, the news is always showing you some city falling apart. Hurricanes, riots, shootings, infrastructure failures. It's tragic, and you feel for those people. But it's also 1,000 miles away, and you have 600 acres of corn that needs to come off before the weather turns. The calculation isn't callous, it's just practical. Whatever was happening in Philadelphia was not happening in my field, and my field was my responsibility. I combined until noon, ate a sandwich in the cab, kept going. By 3 in the afternoon, I'd finished the northeast quarter and swung south. The radio in the combine picks up 2 AM stations reliably, 1 out of Champaign, 1 out of Decatur. And around 4 o'clock, both of them interrupted their regular programming for extended news coverage. Philadelphia was worse. But it wasn't just Philadelphia anymore. There were reports from Baltimore, from Newark, from parts of New York. The word they kept using was aggressive. The affected individuals were extremely aggressive. They attacked without warning, without apparent motive, and this was the detail that made me slow the combine down and actually listen. They didn't stop when injured. A Baltimore police officer, interviewed live, said he'd shot a man center mass 3 times and the man had kept coming. "He was on the ground and he was still reaching for me," the officer said. And his voice had a quality in it that I recognized, because I'd heard it in my own voice once, the time a bull pinned me against a gate and I thought I was going to die. It was the sound of a person who has encountered something that doesn't fit the rules. I finished combining at 7:30 that evening, pulled the machine into the shed, walked to the house, turned on the television again. In the 3.5 hours since I'd last looked, the map had changed. It wasn't 3 cities anymore. It was a belt running from southern Connecticut to northern Virginia, with scattered reports as far west as Pittsburgh and as far south as Richmond. The word zombie was not being used by any major network. They were calling it an unknown pathological aggression syndrome, or a rapidly spreading behavioral contagion. But on my phone, On the platforms where people post without editors, the word was everywhere. Video after video of things I won't describe in detail, because you've either seen them or you haven't. And either way, the description doesn't capture what it actually feels like to watch a human being behave like that. The specific horror isn't the violence, it's the absence. The face is still a face, but the person is gone. I called Sophie. She picked up on the first ring. She was at her mother's house in Bloomington. She'd seen the news. She was scared, but holding it together. I told her I loved her and to keep the doors locked, and I'd call again in the morning. I called my ex-wife, Karen, and had a short, civil conversation in which we both pretended we weren't terrified. I called Ray Oleska next door and got his voicemail. I called Darnell, and he picked up. "You see it?" he said. I saw it. "What do you think?" I didn't know what I thought. I told him that. He said he was parked at a truck stop outside Indianapolis, and the lot was fuller than he'd ever seen it. People were fueling up and heading in every direction. He said the truck stop had sold out of bottled water by 2 in the afternoon. He said there was a fight at the diesel pumps. He said the interstate was running, but slow. "Come to the farm if you need to," I said. "Yeah," he said. "I might." That night I didn't sleep well. I lay in bed and listened to the house creak the way it always does, and tried to convince myself that this was a regional event, that it was being contained, that in a week they'd have it controlled and I'd look back and feel silly for worrying. But I've been farming long enough to know what it looks like when something gets ahead of you. A late blight, a flood, a market crash. There's a point where the thing is still manageable, and then there's the next day, when it isn't. And the only difference between the two is that on the first day you can see the edges of it, and on the second day you can't. Lying in bed that Thursday night, listening to the Champaign station cycle through the same updates with a few more cities added each time, I felt the edges disappearing. Friday morning I combined for 2 hours and then stopped. I stopped because the Champaign station reported cases in Chicago. Chicago is 3 hours north of me. That's not 1,000 miles. That's not a television distance. That's a driving distance. That's a distance that someone could walk in a few days if they had a reason to walk. I parked the combine and went inside and sat at the kitchen table with a pad of legal paper and a pen. I wrote down everything I had. 1,200 acres, 2 grain bins holding roughly 40,000 bushels of corn between them, the harvest store with about 200 tons of silage, a cattle herd of 32 head, including the bull, a well with an electric pump, plus a hand pump on the old well behind the house that my grandmother used to use, a diesel tank, 500 gallons, about 3/4 full, a propane tank, 1,000 gallons, recently filled for winter, the machine shed full of equipment, the workshop with tools, a chest freezer in the basement with half a steer and 40 pounds of pork, a pantry that Karen used to keep stocked and that I'd maintained out of habit, holding maybe 3 months of canned goods for one person. Ammunition, several hundred rounds of various calibers. Firearms, the Remington 870, a 30-06 bolt-action, a .22 rifle, and a 9mm handgun. I looked at that list for a long time. Then I wrote a second list. Things I didn't have. Medical supplies beyond a basic first aid kit. Antibiotics. Solar power. A perimeter. A plan. I drove to Calvary. The town was quiet in a way that wasn't quite normal. The gas station had a line, which it never does. The farm and home store was busier than a Saturday. I went there first and bought everything that seemed relevant without overthinking it. Fence posts, rolls of barbed wire, cable, bolt cutters, tarps, a case of butane lighters, water purification tablets, 2 more first aid kits, all the batteries they had, and 16 bags of concrete mix. The owner, Phil Dugan, rang me up without commentary. But when I was loading the truck, he came out and said, "You think it's going to get here?" I said I didn't know. He said, "My brother's in Columbus. He says they're telling people to stay home." I said that sounded like good advice. He said, "You buying all this for the farm?" I said yes. He looked at me for a moment, and then he said, "I've got a pallet of canned goods in the back I was going to put on the shelf Monday. You want it?" I bought the whole pallet, $1,200. Phil helped me load it. Neither of us said anything else about why. I went to the hardware store next and bought every padlock, every chain, every roll of wire they had. I bought PVC pipe and fittings for a reason I hadn't fully articulated yet, but that turned out to be water distribution. I bought a hand crank radio. I bought work gloves by the dozen. I drove home and unloaded everything into the machine shed and stood there looking at it. And the feeling I had was the same feeling I get when I look at a forecast that shows a derecho coming. You can see it. You can prepare for it. But you can't stop it. And you don't know exactly when it will hit or how bad it will be. And the waiting is its own kind of violence. Friday afternoon. I called Sophie again. She was fine. Karen was fine. Bloomington was fine. I said, "Baby, I want you and your mom to come to the farm." Silence. Then, "Dad, it's in Philadelphia. That's like 1,000,000 miles away." "It's in Chicago now." More silence. Then, "I'll talk to Mom." Karen called me 20 minutes later and told me, politely, that I was overreacting. She said the governor was holding a press conference at 5. She said Bloomington was perfectly safe. She said Sophie had a chemistry test on Monday and she wasn't pulling her out of school for what was probably going to be contained by the weekend. I didn't argue. I wanted to, but 3 years of post-divorce communication had taught me that arguing with Karen pushed her further from whatever position I wanted her to take. So I said okay. I said call me if anything changes. I said I love Sophie. She said she knew. Friday evening, I started working on the perimeter. The farm's boundary is roughly a rectangle, bordered by county roads on the east and south, a drainage ditch on the west, and raised fence line on the north. The total perimeter is approximately 4 miles. I couldn't fence 4 miles. Not quickly, not alone. But I could control access. There were exactly 5 points where a vehicle could enter the property. 2 field gates on the county road, the main driveway, a service entrance near the grain bins, and a gap in the west fence where I'd been meaning to put a gate for 3 years and never had. I drove to each one and assessed. The main driveway was the priority. It was a 1/4-mile gravel lane running from the county road straight to the farmstead. I pulled the skid loader out and pushed a berm of earth across it about 200 yards from the road. Not a wall, just a mound high enough that you couldn't drive over it without serious clearance. Then I parked the old hay wagon sideways behind the berm. It wasn't a fortress. It was a speed bump. But speed bumps buy time, and time was the thing I was going to need the most. I welded the 2 field gates shut. I strung new barbed wire across the service entrance in 3 layers, tight enough to slow a person and stop a vehicle. The west gap I filled with a section of old cattle panel and a length of logging chain. Then I went home, ate cold leftover chili, and fell asleep on the couch with the television on. Saturday morning I woke up to Sophie's phone call. "Dad, there are people eating each other outside the school." I've already told you this part. I've already told you about the drive. What I haven't told you is what Bloomington looked like when I got there. It looked like a place that had been normal 2 hours ago and was now deciding, block by block, whether to be normal or not. Some streets were empty. Some had people moving fast, carrying things. One intersection had a car on its side, burning, and no one attending to it. I saw a woman standing in her front yard in a bathrobe, holding a garden rake, watching the street like she was waiting for someone to explain what the rake was for. The grocery store parking lot was full, but the store was dark. A police car sat at an intersection with its lights on and no one inside. Sophie's school was in lockdown. I called her from the parking lot, and she came to a second-floor window, and I told her to come down to the gym entrance on the east side. She said the teachers weren't letting anyone leave. I said I would handle it. I walked to the gym entrance and banged on the door until a man I later learned was the assistant principal opened it, and I said, "I'm Dale Mercer. I'm here for my daughter Sophie Mercer, and I'm not leaving without her." He started to say something about protocol, and I said, "Sir, there is no protocol for this. Give me my daughter." Something in my voice or my face convinced him, because he let me in, and Sophie was in the hallway, and then she was in my arms, and she was shaking but she wasn't crying, and I thought, that's my girl. I tried to get Karen. Called her 6 times on the drive across town. No answer. I drove to her house. The door was open. Not broken. Open. Her car was gone. Her phone was on the kitchen counter. I took the phone. I wrote a note on the back of an envelope. I have Sophie. Going to the farm. Come to the farm. I left it on the table where she'd see it. We drove back. An hour and 40 minutes going was 2.5 hours coming back, because Interstate 74 was a parking lot heading west and not much better heading east. I took county roads, back roads I knew from decades of driving between Bloomington and home. Sophie sat in the passenger seat and didn't speak for the first 30 minutes. Then she said, "Dad, what's wrong with them? The people outside the school. What's wrong with them?" I said I didn't know. She said, "They were biting. I saw it from the window. They were biting people, and the people they bit got up and started doing it too." I said, "I know." She said, "Is Mom okay?" I said I was sure she was. I said she probably went to Grandma Jean's house, which was Karen's mother, who lived in a senior community in Peoria. I said we'd find her. I said everything was going to be fine. I said it with enough conviction that Sophie believed me, or at least stopped asking, which at that point served the same function. We got to the farm at 2 in the afternoon Saturday. The berm was undisturbed. The gates were intact. The farm looked exactly like it had when I'd left. Quiet, wide, empty. The corn standing in the south fields. The cattle grazing in the east pasture, like the world was exactly what it had always been. Sophie went inside, and I stood in the driveway and looked out at that enormous Illinois sky, and felt 2 things simultaneously. Relief so deep it buckled my knees, and a fear so comprehensive it was almost calm. Because I knew, standing there, that the world Sophie and I had just driven through was coming here. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it was coming. And when it came, this farm was all we had. I went to work. Saturday afternoon and evening, I did not stop moving. I showed Sophie the hand pump on the old well and made her pump it until she knew the rhythm. I moved the chest freezer's contents into coolers and staged them in the basement. I inventoried ammunition. I checked every door and window in the house and screwed plywood over the first-floor windows that didn't have curtains thick enough to block light at night. I killed the outside lights. Every one of them. If you couldn't see us, you couldn't come to us. That was the theory. At 9 o'clock Saturday night, headlights came up the county road and stopped at my berm. I picked up the shotgun and walked out. It was Darnell. He'd driven straight from Indianapolis in his personal truck, not the semi. He had his girlfriend Keisha with him, and her 10-year-old son, Marcus. They had 4 duffel bags, a case of bottled water, and the look that everyone who arrived at the farm would eventually have. The expression of a person who has driven through something they don't have words for yet, and has arrived at a place that still looks like the old world and can't quite believe it. I moved the hay wagon, let them through, put the wagon back. Darnell said, "Indianapolis is gone, man." I said, "Gone how?" He said, Gone. They're on the interstates. Not driving, walking. Thousands of them. I saw a line of them on I-70 that went from one horizon to the other. Just walking. Not fast, but they don't stop. Dale, they don't stop. Keisha was holding Marcus against her side. The boy was asleep standing up, that way kids can do when they've been scared past exhaustion. I took them inside. Sophie made up beds. I put food on the table. We were 6. The farm had been one for 3 years, and now it was 6, and the adjustment was instant and total because there was no time for it to be anything else. Sunday morning, I woke up before dawn and drove the truck to Ray Oleska's place. The house was dark. Both dogs were on the porch, pressed against the door, whimpering. I knocked. No answer. I tried the door. Locked. I went around to the back. The kitchen window was broken from the inside, glass on the ground outside. I climbed through. Ray was on the living room floor. He'd been dead for at least a day, maybe longer. I won't describe what had been done to him, except to say it was consistent with what Sophie had seen outside her school and what Darnell had seen on the interstate. Whatever had gotten in through that kitchen window had gotten to Ray before he could get to the gun cabinet in his bedroom. The cabinet was still locked. I found the key in his desk drawer, which is where he'd always kept it, which is exactly where you should not keep the key to your gun cabinet when the world is ending. I took his guns. A 12-gauge, a .308 hunting rifle, a .22 pistol. I took his ammunition. I took the 2 cases of canned food from his pantry and the 40-pound bag of dog food from the mudroom. I took the dogs. Then I went outside and looked at Ray's farm. He had 3 propane tanks and a diesel tank that was nearly full. He had a generator. He had a tractor with a front-end loader. He had a welding rig better than mine. I drove all of it to my farm over the course of 3 trips. On the last trip, I stopped in Ray's kitchen and said, "I'm sorry, Ray. I'll take care of the dogs." Then I left, and I didn't go back. Sunday was the last day the phones worked. I called Karen's mother in Peoria. She said Karen had arrived Friday night. She said they were safe. She said the senior community had locked its gates and people were staying inside. I said, "Good." I said, "Tell Karen that Sophie is with me." I said, "I love you both." She said she knew. The call dropped, and I never spoke to either of them again. Sunday night, the power went out. Not a flicker. Not a brownout. Just gone. One moment the house was humming with electricity, and the next it was silent in a way houses aren't supposed to be. You don't realize how much noise your life makes until it stops. The refrigerator, the furnace fan, the water heater, the little LED on the smoke detector. All of it, gone. Replaced by a silence so total that the first thing I heard in it was my own heartbeat. I had Ray's generator. I started it, ran it for 2 hours to keep the freezers cold, then shut it off. Diesel was finite. Everything was finite now. Every gallon, every round, every can of food was a unit of time. Use it, and it's gone. Keep it, and you live another day. The math was that simple and that brutal. Monday through Wednesday of that first week, I worked on the perimeter. Darnell worked with me. He wasn't a farmer, but he was strong, willing, and mechanically competent. He could drive anything with wheels and fix most things with engines. We used my tractor and rays to dig a trench along the south boundary, 4 feet deep and 5 feet wide, piling the excavated dirt on the farm side to create a berm. It wasn't pretty. It looked like a World War I photograph. But a 4-foot trench will stop a person who can't think. And from everything I'd seen on the news before it stopped broadcasting, the infected couldn't think. They could walk, they could grab, they could bite, but they couldn't solve problems. A trench was a problem. We trenched the south and east sides by Wednesday evening. The west side had the drainage ditch already, 8 feet wide and 3 feet deep in most places, deeper after rain. I reinforced it by stringing barbed wire at shin height on both sides. The north boundary was Ray's fence line, cattle quality, 4 strands of barbed wire. Not ideal, but the north was also where his fields were, and those fields were standing corn. Tall, dry, rustling, and loud enough that anything moving through them would announce itself. Wednesday night, a pickup truck appeared on the county road. It stopped at the berm, and a man got out and shouted. I walked out with the shotgun. He was maybe 30, wearing a polo shirt and khakis like he'd left an office job in a hurry. A woman was in the passenger seat, 2 kids in the back. Please, he said. We've been driving for 2 days. We're out of gas. We just need a place to stop. Here is where I want to be honest with you, because honesty is the only thing I have left that costs me nothing. My first instinct was to say no. My first instinct, standing there with a shotgun and a berm and a trench and a farm full of food, was to protect what I had by keeping him out. That instinct was not evil. It was not even selfish exactly. It was the instinct of a man who has a daughter asleep in the house and a finite supply of everything and no way to verify that this stranger with his office clothes and his frightened kids was what he appeared to be. I had seen, in the 3 days since this began, enough of what people become when the rules disappear. Darnell had told me about the truck stop fights. The radio, before it died, had described looting, carjackings, armed gangs stripping stores. The infected were a horror, but they were a simple horror. It was the uninfected that kept me awake at night, because they could plan. I looked at the man. I looked at the woman. I looked at the 2 kids in the back seat, their faces lit by the truck's dome light, and one of them was about Sophie's age. I moved the hay wagon. Their names were Tom and Lydia Harding. The kids were Ethan, 14, and Bree, 11. They were from a suburb of Chicago. They'd left Thursday, the same day I was combining corn and ignoring Darnell's texts, and had been driving south and east ever since, sleeping in the truck, eating gas station food until the gas stations closed. Tom was an IT project manager. Lydia was a dental hygienist. Neither of them had ever fired a gun or grown a vegetable or started a generator. They had no supplies, no tools, no skills that applied to the world as it now existed. But Tom could learn. And Lydia, I discovered within 48 hours, was a natural organizer who could take a chaotic situation and impose structure on it the way a foreman runs a crew. She took over the food inventory without being asked and created a rationing system so clean and fair that no one questioned it. She divided the canned goods by calorie density and created meal plans that stretched 3 months of food for one person into 6 weeks for 8, which was what we were now. 8 people. 2 men who could do physical labor, 2 women who could manage systems, 4 young people who could be taught, and 1,200 acres of land that needed to become something it had never been. Not just a farm, but a fortress. Over the next 2 weeks, more people came. A family of 3, Luis, Maria, and their 6-year-old daughter, Anna, walked up the county road on foot, carrying everything they owned in backpacks. They'd walked from Champaign. Luis was a roofer. He looked at my buildings with the eye of a man who understands structures and said, "You need to reinforce that cattle barn. The east wall is weak." He was right. I hadn't noticed. He fixed it in a day. An older couple, Frank and Diane Woodley, drove in from Danville in a Buick sedan with 3 cats in carriers and a trunk full of prescription medications. Frank had been a pharmacist. Diane had been a nurse. They were both in their 60s, both calm, both carrying the quiet efficiency of people who've spent their careers managing emergencies in real time. Frank took one look at my first aid kit and said, "This is not going to work." And then he spent 2 days organizing every medical supply on the farm into a triage system inside the spare bedroom. A young man named Jesse walked out of the cornfield one morning. Just appeared. No bag, no supplies, no explanation beyond, "I've been walking for a week." He was maybe 22. He didn't talk much, but he worked. God, he worked. Whatever task you gave Jesse, he did it until it was done. And then he stood there, waiting for the next one. I gave him the job of maintaining the trenches, checking for erosion, clearing debris, reinforcing sections that rain softened. And he did it every day without being asked, like the trench was his personal responsibility, like keeping it 4 feet deep was his way of earning the food he ate. 14 people by the end of October, then 16, then 19. Each new arrival forced the same calculation. More hands meant more labor, more watchers, more capability. But more mouths meant faster consumption of food, water, fuel. The math was always running in my head. 40,000 bushels of corn sounds like an ocean of food until you realize that field corn isn't sweet corn. You can't eat it off the cob. It needs to be processed, ground into meal, soaked in lye for hominy, or fed to the cattle who convert it into meat and milk. I had a hand-crank grain mill that my grandmother had kept as a decoration on a shelf in the kitchen. It became one of the most important tools on the farm. Lydia organized grinding shifts. 2 hours a day, 2 people at a time, turning raw corn into coarse meal that could be cooked into porridge, baked into flatbread, or mixed into soups. It was tedious, physical, mind-numbing work, and it kept us alive. The cattle were the other pillar. 32 head, including a bull and 8 cows that were still producing milk. We slaughtered 2 steers in the first month and processed the meat as carefully as we could, salting and smoking what we couldn't eat immediately. Frank Woodley, the pharmacist, turned out to have grown up on a farm in Kentucky and knew how to butcher. I hadn't known that about him. The apocalypse reveals things about people that normal life never asks to see. November brought the first real test. The weather turned hard in the first week. A cold front dropped temperatures into the 20s and brought freezing rain that coated everything in a shell of ice. The trench on the south side partially collapsed where the soil was clay-heavy and the ice expanded the walls. 3 sections needed to be redug. Jesse and Darnell worked on it in the rain for 2 days, and on the second day, Darnell slipped and fell into the trench and broke his left wrist. Diane set it with materials from Frank's medical supply, but Darnell couldn't work for weeks, which cut our heavy labor capacity by 1/3. The freezing rain also killed my generator. Water got into the fuel line and the engine seized. Luis spent 3 days taking it apart in the workshop, cleaning every component and reassembling it. He got it running again, but it was never reliable after that. We ran it only when absolutely necessary, to charge the car batteries we used for lights, to power the well pump for water fill-ups, to run the freezer for a few hours at a time. The rest of our lives became unpowered. Oil lamps, candles, fire. In the second week of November, the infected reached us. I had been expecting it. The math of their movement, slow, steady, radiating outward from population centers, meant they would arrive in east-central Illinois sometime in mid-November. And that's exactly when they came. The first one appeared on a Tuesday morning, standing in the county road about 100 yards from the east gate. Just standing there. A woman, or what had been a woman, in a hospital gown, barefoot, motionless. Jesse spotted her from the grain bin roof where he'd been keeping a dawn watch. I went out with the 30-06. I stood on the berm and looked at her through the scope. She was maybe 40, thin. Her feet were black with frostbite. Her face had the look, you know the look if you've seen it. Empty. Not sleeping, not dead, not alive in any way that word means. Vacant. A body running on whatever was left after the person had been erased. She stood there for 6 hours. Then she walked into the field across the road, slowly, aimlessly, and disappeared into the standing corn. I didn't shoot her. I had decided, after a long night of thinking, that gunshots were sound, and sound was a beacon. We would use guns only if the perimeter was actively breached. Everything else we would handle quietly. Darnell had fashioned spears from steel fence posts sharpened on the grinder. Luis had built 2 crossbows from plans he found in a book in my house. Rough, ugly things, but effective at 20 yards. That was our doctrine. Quiet. Invisible. Let them pass. They didn't always pass. By late November, we were seeing groups. 3, 5, 8 at a time, walking the county road or cutting through the fields. Most of them went by without stopping. They followed the road, or they followed each other, or they followed something we couldn't perceive. A sound, a smell, some signal in whatever ruined circuitry still fired inside their skulls. But some of them found the trench, and the trench did what it was designed to do. They fell in. They couldn't climb out. They stood at the bottom, looking up, reaching, making a sound that I will hear for the rest of my life. A low, wet, aspirated moan, like air leaking from a punctured lung. We dispatched them from above with the spears. Jesse did most of it. He never hesitated, never flinched, never seemed affected. I asked him once if it bothered him, and he said, "They're already gone, Mr. Mercer. I'm just finishing the paperwork." I didn't know what to make of that. I still don't. December brought the human threat. A group of 7 men arrived at the east gate in 2 pickup trucks. They were armed. Rifles, shotguns, at least 1 handgun visible. The lead man got out and walked to the berm and shouted that he wanted to talk. I went out with Tom Harding and Luis. I carried the shotgun. Tom carried Ray's .308. Luis carried a crossbow. The man said his name was Dale, same as mine, which I didn't like. And he said his group had been working their way south from Kankakee, and they needed fuel and food. He said it like a request, but his body language said it like a demand. The other 6 men were still in the trucks, watching. One of them was smiling, and it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a person who has calculated odds and likes what he's calculated. I said we didn't have fuel or food to spare. He said, "That's a lot of farmland for a man with nothing to spare." I said, "It's feeding 19 people." He said, "Well, maybe it needs to feed 26. There was a silence. The wind was blowing from the north, cold, steady, carrying the smell of dead corn and frost. Tom shifted the rifle in his hands, not raising it, just adjusting his grip in a way that was visible. Louise stood absolutely still, which was more intimidating than any movement would have been. I said, "You're welcome to move on. There's a town 4 miles east, some buildings there. Might find what you need." The man looked at me. He looked at Tom. He looked at Louise. He looked past us at the farm, the grain bins rising against the gray sky, the smoke from the house chimney, the cattle visible in the pasture. He was doing the same math I'd been doing since October. He was looking at 40,000 bushels and 32 head of cattle and a functioning well, and he was calculating what it would take to own that instead of me. He said, "We'll think about it." They left. I didn't sleep for 3 nights. On the 4th night, they came back. 2 in the morning. No headlights. They parked on the county road and came on foot. Jesse, who had taken the night watch on the grain bin, saw them moving across the south field toward the trench. He woke me with a whistle. 3 short blasts, our signal for human approach. There were 5 of them. 2 had stayed with the trucks. The 5 were carrying bolt cutters, which meant they'd planned to cut through wire, not knowing about the trench. The first one went into it. He yelled. The second one stopped at the edge. I lit the spotlight, a truck headlight wired to a car battery mounted on a fence post, and pinned them in a cone of white light. "You're on my land," I said, and my voice sounded like someone else's voice, someone harder and older and less conflicted. "You will leave now, or I will fire." They left. They pulled their man out of the trench. He'd broken an ankle, and they left. They took their trucks and drove east toward Calvary. 2 days later, Lydia spotted a column of smoke rising from the direction of town. We never saw the men again. I don't know what happened in Calvary. I don't want to know. But the incident changed something in me, and in the farm. We couldn't just be a farm anymore. We had to be a place that looked hard enough to not be worth the cost of taking. I dismantled the old hay elevator and used the steel to build a gate at the main entrance. A real gate, welded, heavy, mounted on posts sunk in concrete. Darnell, his wrist healing, designed a watch rotation that put 2 people on elevated positions 24 hours a day, one on the grain bin and one on the house roof. Tom organized the weapons into a system. Who carried what, where the ammunition was stored, who had authority to fire and under what circumstances. Rules. Structure. The farm was becoming a compound, and the compound was becoming a community, and the community was developing governance whether I wanted it to or not. I want to tell you about the hardest night. It was mid-December. A blizzard came through. Real blizzard. Not just snow, but wind-driven horizontal ice that reduced visibility to 0 and dropped the temperature to 8 below. The cattle huddled in the barn. We huddled in the house. 21 people. 2 more had arrived in early December, a brother and sister named Paul and Christine, who'd walked from Terre Haute. Packed into a 4-bedroom farmhouse, sleeping on floors, sharing blankets, breathing each other's air. Around midnight, someone banged on the gate. Jesse, on watch, radioed down. We'd found walkie-talkies in Ray's house, and said there were people outside. A lot of people. I put on everything I owned and walked out into the blizzard. There were 34 of them. Men, women, children. They'd come from the south, from a community that had tried to hold a church in a small town called Redfield, and the community had been overrun 2 days ago. They'd been walking since. They were frostbitten, starving, terrified, and several of them were injured. A woman in the front was holding a baby wrapped in a sleeping bag. The baby was not crying, and in that cold, a baby that wasn't crying was a baby I was afraid to look at closely. 34 people. I had 21 inside. 40,000 bushels of corn sounds like a lot, but it was mid-December and we'd been eating it for 2 months, and grinding it by hand, and feeding it to the cattle, and the number had dropped to maybe 32,000. My well produced about 15 gallons a minute, and the hand pump produced about 5. My medical supplies were adequate for 21 people with normal needs. My fuel was dwindling. My ammunition was finite. My house was already at capacity. 34 more would double us, would cut every timeline in half, would bring people I hadn't vetted into a perimeter I'd spent 2 months building, would introduce unknown health conditions, unknown psychological states, unknown loyalties, would mean that the food I'd calculated to last until May would last until March, maybe February. And after that, we were dependent on a spring planting season that might not come if the infected were thick enough to prevent field work. And standing in front of me was a woman with a baby, and behind her were 33 people who would die in this blizzard if I said no. I want you to understand that I stood there for a long time. I stood in 8 below wind with ice forming on my beard, and I did the math, and the math said no. The math was clear. The math was responsible. The math was the same math that every leader of every overwhelmed lifeboat in history has done, and the answer is always the same. You cannot save everyone, and trying to save everyone kills everyone. Sophie appeared beside me. I don't know when she came out. She was wearing my old Carhartt coat, the one that went to her knees, and she was looking at the people outside the gate. She said, "Dad." That's all she said. Just my name. But she said it in a way that made it a complete argument. She said it in a way that meant, I know the math. I know the risk. I know what you're calculating. But these are people. And we are people. And if we stop acting like people, then what are we saving? I opened the gate. 55 people slept on the Mercer farm that night. Every room, every hallway, the machine shed with the space heaters running off the generator. The baby was alive. Her name was Grace. Her mother, Tanya, had kept her warm through 2 days of walking by holding her inside her coat against her skin. And the baby had survived on body heat and willpower. Diane checked her and said she was dehydrated but stable. Frank found infant formula in the supplies that one of the Redfield group had carried. Grace drank and slept, and her crying, when it finally came hours later, thin and reedy and furious, was the best sound I had ever heard on that farm. But the math didn't lie. 55 people consumed resources at a rate that made my original calculations meaningless. I sat with Lydia and Tom the next morning, and we rebuilt the numbers. At current consumption, we had food until late February. That was it. Not May, not April. February. After that, we were starving. Unless we expanded production. This is the part of the story where I stopped being a farmer defending a farm and started being something else. A planner, a coordinator, an architect of a system that hadn't existed before. I called a meeting. All 55 people packed into the machine shed. I stood on a hay bale and told them the truth. I told them how much food we had. I told them how long it would last. I told them what the options were. And then I said something I hadn't planned to say, something that came from a place deeper than calculation. I said, "This farm has been in my family for almost 100 years. My grandfather cleared this ground. My father planted these fields. I've spent my whole life keeping it going, and there were years when keeping it going made no sense, when the crop prices were low and the equipment was breaking and the bank was calling. And I kept going anyway. I kept going because this land is not just dirt. It's a promise. It's the promise that if you work hard enough and plan far enough ahead and don't give up, the land will feed you. I am making that promise to every person in this room. If you work, the land will feed you. But you have to work. Every one of you. Every day. Starting now. The Redfield group included a woman named Denise, who had been an agricultural extension agent for the University of Illinois. When she heard me talk about the grain supply and the cattle and the acreage, she came to me afterward and said, "You're sitting on a viable operation, but you're thinking like a conventional farmer. You need to think like a subsistence operation." She was right. She redesigned our entire approach. Instead of managing the corn as a cash crop to be processed slowly, we began systematic conversion, feeding more to the cattle to increase milk and meat production, setting aside seed corn for spring planting, and establishing a greenhouse operation using the plastic sheeting and PVC pipe I'd bought in Calvary back in October. Denise knew which crops could grow in a cold frame in winter: spinach, kale, certain lettuces, radishes. Within 2 weeks, we had 4 crude greenhouses producing greens. Luis and his crew, he'd become the de facto construction foreman, expanded the trench system and reinforced it with sharpened stakes at the bottom. They built a second gate on the north side, using steel from Ray's equipment. They fortified the cattle barn and added a sleeping loft above it that could hold 12 people. They dug a root cellar. They built composting latrines. The farm was transforming, and it was transforming fast, because 55 people with nothing to do but survive generate an enormous amount of labor when properly directed. January was brutal. The cold was relentless, below zero for 9 consecutive days in the second week. We burned through propane faster than I'd projected. The generator failed again, and this time Luis couldn't fix it. We lost power entirely and went to hand-pumped water, oil lamps, and fire. 2 of the older members of the Redfield group, a man named Harold and a woman named Betts, developed pneumonia. Frank and Diane worked around the clock. Harold recovered. Betts did not. We buried her in the east pasture next to Ray, and Frank said a few words, and 54 people stood in the snow and mourned a woman most of them had known for less than a month. The infected were less active in deep winter. Cold slowed them, froze some of them. Jesse found a group of 4 in the south trench one morning, standing motionless, ice coating their skin and hair, still technically moving, fingers twitching, jaws working slowly, but functionally immobilized. He dispatched them. We found more as the weeks went on. The cold was an ally, but an ally that also attacked us, and the cost of fighting both threats simultaneously was exhaustion on a scale I'd never experienced. February brought a different crisis. Not external, but internal. 54 people living in close quarters, under extreme stress, with diminishing resources, will fracture along lines you don't expect. The Redfield group had their own internal dynamics, alliances, grudges, a leadership structure centered around a man named Owen, who had been the pastor of the church they'd sheltered in. Owen was not a bad man, but he was accustomed to being in charge, and the farm was not his to be in charge of. And the tension between his authority and mine became a constant, low-grade friction. It came to a head over water. Owen believed water distribution should be equal. Every person, same amount, regardless of role. I believed that people doing heavy physical labor needed more water than people who weren't. This sounds like a small disagreement. It wasn't. It was a disagreement about who got to decide how resources were allocated, which was really a disagreement about who was in charge, which was really a disagreement about whether the farm was my property or our community. Owen framed it as fairness. I framed it as survival. We argued in front of 30 people, and the argument got loud and it got personal. And Owen said, "You act like you own these people because you own this land." And I said, "I act like I'm responsible for these people because I am responsible for this land. And this land is the only thing between all of us and nothing." Lydia brokered a compromise. She created a water allocation system based on activity level, transparent to everyone, administered by a committee of 3. One from the original farm group, one from the Redfield group, one elected at large. It worked. Not because it was perfect, but because it distributed authority. And distributing authority turned out to be the thing that held us together. I couldn't run the farm like a patriarch anymore. It wasn't my farm. It was our farm. And the moment I accepted that, really accepted it, not just said the words, was the moment the Mercer farm became something that might actually survive. March. The thaw. The most dangerous time. When the ground softened and the temperature climbed above freezing, 2 things happened simultaneously. First, the infected reactivated. The ones that had frozen weren't all dead. Some of them thawed and resumed moving, slower at first, then faster as the warmth returned. We went from seeing 1 or 2 a week to seeing 10, 15, 20 a day on the county road, in the fields, at the perimeter. The trenches held, the gates held, the watch system held, but the pressure was constant. And constant pressure wears people in ways that crisis doesn't, because crisis has peaks and valleys, and constant pressure is just a weight that never lifts. Second, the thaw meant planting season, and planting season meant field work, and field work meant people outside the perimeter. This was the decision I dreaded most. To plant, we needed to get into the south and east fields, hundreds of acres of open, unprotected ground. The corn planter required someone on the tractor, exposed, for hours at a time. The fields needed to be disked first, which meant more hours, more exposure. And all of this in an environment where infected were wandering the same landscape. We developed a system. 3-person security teams accompanied every field operation. 2 on foot with the crossbows and spears. 1 on elevated observation. Usually the bed of a pickup truck, which gave enough height to see across the flat ground. The tractor driver wore a harness attached to a rope, so that if something happened, they could be pulled off the tractor quickly. It was clumsy, slow, and terrifying. The first day of planting, I drove the tractor myself because I wasn't going to ask anyone else to do something I wouldn't do. I planted 40 acres in 6 hours and saw 11 infected in the distance, none closer than a quarter mile. My hands shook the entire time, not from cold, from the knowledge that I was sitting on top of the only running engine for miles, and that engine was a sound. And sound was a beacon. And every minute I ran it, I was announcing our location to everything within earshot. We planted 300 acres. Corn, soybeans, a section of wheat that Denise insisted on. It was the most terrifying agricultural work ever done. And it was also the most important. Because without that crop, we were dead by August, no matter how many trenches we dug. April brought the last major arrival. A group of 11 people from Champaign, led by a woman named Dr. Karen Osei, a professor of civil engineering at the university. They'd been sheltering in the engineering building on campus and had been forced out when a massive horde, hundreds of infected, overwhelmed the university's improvised defenses. They'd driven until they ran out of gas and then walked. Dr. Osei carried a laptop with a solar charger, and on that laptop she had a downloaded archive of agricultural manuals, engineering references, medical textbooks, and water treatment protocols. That laptop became our library. 65 people. Dr. Osei looked at our trench system and said, "This works, but it's a passive defense. It only delays. You need active infrastructure." She designed a water catchment system that tripled our storage capacity. She redesigned the greenhouse ventilation. She sketched plans for a windmill, an actual windmill, using parts from the farm equipment we no longer needed. Luis built it. It wasn't beautiful. It was a Frankenstein of tractor parts and steel sheeting and automotive alternator. But it generated electricity. Not much. Enough to charge batteries. Enough to run a single light. Enough to power the walkie-talkies. Enough to feel like the world was not only subtracting. By May, the farm looked nothing like it had in October. The neat, quiet farmstead my grandfather would have recognized was gone. In its place was a sprawling, improvised settlement, surrounded by trenches and berms and wire. The house was a medical station and nursery. The machine shed was a dormitory. The cattle barn was a dormitory. 3 new structures, crude, wooden, insulated with straw, had been built by Luis's crew to house the overflow. The greenhouses were producing. The cattle were managed in rotation between pastures. The hand-ground cornmeal was supplemented with fresh greens and milk, and increasingly, eggs from a flock of chickens that someone in the Redfield group had brought, and that had, against all odds, thrived. And the corn we'd planted in March was coming up. Rows of green across the south fields, visible from the grain bin, straight and even and alive. I stood on that bin roof one morning in early May and looked at those rows and felt something I hadn't felt since October. Not hope exactly. Hope is forward-looking, and I'd learned not to look too far forward, because forward was where the things you couldn't control lived. What I felt was something more like adequacy. The land was doing what I'd promised it would do. We were working, and the land was feeding us, and 65 people were alive because of that transaction. But survival is not a stable state. It's a negotiation that never ends. The summer brought heat, and the heat brought the infected, in numbers we hadn't seen before. They moved in loose groups, sometimes dozens at a time, drifting across the landscape like schools of fish. Most passed by. Some found the perimeter and fell into the trenches, and we dealt with them. But in July, a group of approximately 80 came from the northeast, from the direction of what had been Champaign, and they hit the north boundary, Ray's old fence line, the weakest section of our perimeter, and pushed through it. The fence went down in 4 places simultaneously. Jesse, on watch, rang the alarm. An old school bell mounted on a pole, and every able-bodied person grabbed a weapon and ran. It was the closest thing to a battle we ever fought. 23 of us against 80 of them, in the north pasture, in the July heat, with spears and crossbows and, when the crossbows weren't enough, guns. I fired the shotgun that day, fired it 9 times. Tom fired the .308. Darnell, his wrist long-heeled, fired the .30-06. The sound of those guns echoed across the flat land, and I knew it would draw more. But the alternative was being overrun, and being overrun was the end of everything. It lasted an hour. It felt like a week. When it was over, the north pasture was a place I don't want to describe in detail. We'd lost one person, Paul, Christine's brother, the quiet man from Terre Haute. He'd been pulled down when 3 of them came through a gap he was trying to close. Christine screamed his name, and Luis and Jesse pulled her back, and by the time they'd cleared the area, Paul was gone, and what was left was not Paul. We buried him in the east pasture, the 9th grave. Christine didn't speak for 2 weeks. After the north breach, we rebuilt the fence with steel. Not wire, steel panels cut from equipment, welded together, sunk into the ground. It took 3 weeks and used almost all of our remaining welding supplies. But when it was done, the north boundary was the strongest section of the perimeter. We learned something from every failure, and the cost of each lesson was measured in graves. Late summer. The crops grew. The cattle calved. 3 new calves, all healthy. The chickens multiplied. Denise started a seed-saving program, selecting the best ears of corn for next year's planting. Dr. Osei's windmill powered a small refrigeration unit that kept medications viable. Frank and Diane trained 4 people in basic medical care, expanding our health coverage. Lydia ran the food system with an efficiency that would have impressed a logistics company. Owen led daily gatherings, not church services exactly, but something like them, that gave people a rhythm and a reason to feel like a community rather than a collection of refugees. I stopped thinking of myself as the owner of the farm. I'm not sure when exactly. It was a gradual thing, like a fever breaking. You don't feel the exact moment your temperature drops. You just realize at some point that you're not burning anymore. The farm belonged to 65 people. My name was on the deed, and my grandfather had cleared the ground, and my father had planted it, and I had maintained it. But the thing it had become, this strange, fragile, accidental village, that belonged to everyone who dug a trench or ground a bushel of corn, or stood watch in the cold, or buried a friend in the east pasture. I was the steward, not the owner, the steward. And a steward's job is not to hold, but to tend. September, 1 year since the outbreak. The anniversary wasn't marked on any calendar, but everyone felt it. There was a weight in the air that week, a collective awareness that we had survived something that had killed, we didn't know how many. Millions, maybe hundreds of millions. The radio silence that had settled over the world in November of the previous year had never lifted. We had no contact with anyone beyond our perimeter. For all we knew, we were the last people alive. We weren't. Dr. Osei's solar-charged laptop occasionally picked up fragmentary shortwave signals, distant, garbled, but human. Proof that somewhere other people were doing what we were doing. Holding on. I want to tell you about one more night. It was late September, just after the harvest. We'd brought in the corn. Not all 300 acres, because we didn't have the manpower to harvest everything by hand, but enough. The grain bins were filling again. The root cellar was stocked with potatoes and turnips from the expanded garden. The cattle were fat. The chickens were laying. For the first time in a year, the math worked. We had enough food to survive the winter. Not comfortably, not abundantly, but enough. I was sitting on the porch of the house my father built in 1974, the house where I grew up, the house that was now a medical station and nursery and headquarters. And Sophie came out and sat beside me. She was 17 now, taller, thinner, older in the eyes than any 17-year-old should be. She'd spent the last year grinding corn and pulling weeds and standing watch and helping Diane with medical care and doing 100 other things that no 16-year-old should have to do. And she'd done all of them without complaint, with a steadiness that made me proud and also broke my heart. Because steadiness like that is purchased with the loss of something softer. She sat beside me, and we looked out at the farm. The last light was fading. You could see the greenhouse roofs glinting. You could see the windmill turning slowly. You could hear, faintly, the sound of people talking in the machine shed dormitory, the clatter of dishes being washed, a child laughing. Grace, probably, Tanya's daughter, who was now walking and talking and who had never known any world but this one. Sophie said, "Do you think Mom is okay?" I hadn't heard from Karen since that Sunday phone call, almost a year ago. I didn't know if she was alive. I didn't know if her mother was alive. I didn't know anything about the world beyond the perimeter, except that it was broken and dangerous and full of things that used to be people. I said, "I hope so, baby." She said, "I think about her every day." I said, "I know. Me too." She said, "I'm glad I'm here, though. I'm glad I'm with you." I put my arm around her. She leaned into me. For a moment, we were just a father and daughter sitting on a porch at the end of a day. And the fact that the day was a day in the middle of an apocalypse didn't change what that felt like. Some things survive everything. Some things have to. She said, "Dad, are we going to be okay?" I looked out at the farm, at the trenches that Jesse maintained every morning, at the steel fence Luis had built, at the greenhouses Denise had designed, at the windmill Dr. Osei had engineered, at the gate Darnell had welded, at the systems Lydia had organized, at the graves in the east pasture. 9 of them now. 9 people who had died inside the perimeter, who had come to this farm hoping to survive and hadn't made it, but who had contributed, every one of them, to the survival of those who remained. 63 people. We'd lost 2 since the beginning, Betts and Paul. 63 people, alive, on 1,200 acres of Illinois farmland that my grandfather had cleared with a team of horses 95 years ago. I said, "Yeah, Soph, I think we're going to be okay." I didn't say it because I was sure. I said it because I was her father, and because the evidence, imperfect, incomplete, and subject to change without notice, supported it. The crops were in. The walls were strong. The people were organized and committed, and despite everything, still capable of the daily miracle of cooperation. We had lost things that could never be replaced. We had gained things we'd never expected. The farm was not what it had been, and we were not who we had been, and the world outside was still a ruin populated by things that wanted to eat us. And none of that changed the fundamental fact that 63 people were sitting down to dinner together on a September evening, and the food on the table had come from the ground beneath their feet. That's the story. Not all of it. You could fill a library with the details I've left out, the small crises and quiet kindnesses and mechanical failures and midnight terrors and moments of unexpected beauty that make up a year of survival. But the shape of it is there. A farm, a family, a threat, a choice. And then another choice, and another, and another. Each one building on the last, each one imperfect, each one made with incomplete information and insufficient resources, and more fear than I'll ever admit out loud. I'm still here. The farm is still here. The trenches are maintained, and the gates are strong, and the windmill turns, and the cattle graze, and the corn grows, and 63 people wake up every morning and do the work that keeps them alive for one more day. We are not safe. We will never be safe. Not the way that word used to mean. But we are here, and we are together, and the land is doing what it has always done, which is feed the people who are willing to work it. My grandfather cleared this ground in 1931, in the middle of the Depression, because he believed that if you owned land and you were willing to work, you could survive anything. He was a stubborn man. My father was a stubborn man. I am a stubborn man. And now there are 63 stubborn people on this piece of ground, and the ground doesn't care who owns it or what's happening beyond the fence line. It only knows rain and sun and seed and time. And it answers the question it has always answered, the only question that has ever mattered. Will you stay? Will you work? Will you endure? We will. We do. We are.